Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is my third opportunity to rise in this House to speak about this important national security and global security issue facing Canada and the free world, Mr. Speaker. The third time I've been able to rise in this House to speak on what should Canada's response be in the face of the fight against ISIS, or ISIL, as we called it really a year ago in the first debates. And like those previous speeches, it's an honour for me to rise in this House for such an important debate on the deployment of our men and women to an area of the world where they will be in harm's way, whether directly in a combat role or indirectly in a support role. We've been fortunate as Canadians to have one of the most effective and professional militaries in the world from our early years as a country, and we send these people into harm's way to promote and protect our values and to support our allies. And that's what the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces, hundreds of them in this last year, have been doing on our behalf. And they have faced risks, Mr. Speaker, in flying combat missions, and we saw they faced risk in friendly fire incidents, and we lost Sergeant Doiron to such an incident, and I had the fortune of visiting his CSOR colleague recovering in hospital from wounds. So this is a very real threat faced by our men and women, and I know that all members in this House acknowledge and respect that role. And what we're debating here, Mr. Speaker, is the role of Canada. Are we a nation that allows other nations to do the difficult work for global security, and we ride on the immense wealth and opportunity we have as a leading member of the G7? Do we cross to the other side of the street as we go by people in distress, or do we take the lead and try and make sure that we combat a force that is committing genocide, horrendous crimes, and is now a global threat, Mr. Speaker? This is one of those quintessential questions facing members of this House. And it's concerned me that the Liberal Party, in this current iteration, doesn't seem to respect its traditions. In fact, in my previous speeches, I spoke about Mackenzie King talking about the deep-lying instinct for freedom that he said all Canadians had. Deep-lying instinct for freedom on the eve of a North American country going to Europe to fight tyranny. Lester B. Pearson said that if a Canadian fires a rifle in Korea or in Germany, they're protecting their freedom and the security of Canadians just as if they fired that rifle on our own soil. So we cannot afford to hide in the blanket of security that distance and wealth provides Canada, Mr. Speaker. We have a responsibility as a nation to play a role that's commensurate with our size, our abilities, and our values. And we've been doing that. 1,100 sorties, Mr. Speaker, on ISIS positions, on storage, and helping cut off supply and financing lines to that force. The result is an effective cutoff of 25 to 30% of the territory that ISIL once held or threatened to hold. People are able to return to areas that they could not 18 months ago. These are huge, huge wins that Canada and our coalition partners are securing, and we're doing so in a way that's meaningful and is commensurate with the remarkable ability of our CF-18s and their crew to make sure that this important security role can be done in a way with minimal to no collateral damage, Mr. Speaker. Our approach in this House, my approach and the approach of the previous government, was a three-pronged approach: humanitarian assistance to this tremendous crisis, aid, and we've been a leading donor, particularly on a per capita level, a refugee response, which our government began and with this new government is doing and expanding, and we're behind that, Mr. Speaker, but we've been playing that role, and in fact the Syrians arriving in airports in recent weeks have been privately sponsored, approved and cleared by the previous government. But the third pillar has always been a military role for Canada, Mr. Speaker. And you need only look around this building to the statue of George Baker in the hall, who was a sitting MP who died in World War I, to know that Canada, from our earliest days as a nation, took that role. We did not pass to the other side of the street, Mr. Speaker. We did not allow other nations to do all the work. We took a role that was never the biggest, was never an aggressive posture, but it was a role supporting the values we have as Canadians and supporting our allies. And that is what we have done. While it's hard for me, Mr. Speaker, to get used to this side of the chamber, one of the positives of a large Liberal government is I'm happy to see more veterans in the House of Commons. And I'm happy that some have taken part in this debate today, including the Minister of National Defence, the Parliamentary Secretary to Veterans Affairs. I think that's a positive thing to have more veteran voices in the chamber. And we have two exceptional new veteran voices in our caucus from new members of our team in Quebec, and very happy with their contribution to the debate today as well, Mr. Speaker. So what I'm urging them to do, and I'm glad to see they're listening, what I'm urging them to do, Mr. Speaker, I know they can't vote for our motion here today, but what I'm hoping they can do is start wrestling back the position of their party that was taken in the past Parliament, Mr. Speaker. They're kind of saddled with the position the Prime Minister took at that time, but I hope they use their experience and influence in their Wednesday meetings to say, we need to return to our Pearsonian ideals, Mr. Speaker, that Canada has a real role to play. And I was concerned deeply by the comments of the Minister of National Defence here today, and I have utmost respect for his tremendous service to Canada. I think all members of this House do. He was a proud commanding officer of one of our fine regiments, the British Columbia Regiment, 21 battle honours with the BC Regiment, Mr. Speaker, and those battle honours were not for humanitarian assistance. They were a recognition that from the early days of that province, its citizens were willing to take a role for our values and our allies, Mr. Speaker. And today he blamed the previous government by saying, I quote, "Where was its leadership when it could have taken out this threat? Looking at the indicators when it was smaller." Meaning, why didn't we move towards ISIS sooner, Mr. Speaker? So I'll remind him and members of this House of what happened. Last September, the Prime Minister announced a 30-day mission where we sent military assessment and advisors into Syria or into Iraq, Mr. Speaker, at the invitation of that government along with our allies to see how we could respond to a force that had pushed so quickly across that region they were almost into Turkey, a NATO ally, Mr. Speaker. After that 30-day assessment period, the previous Prime Minister brought to this House the decision to deploy combat troops in that mission, Mr. Speaker, and we had a debate. The then third-party leader, now Prime Minister, said, and mockingly, should we just send a few aging aircraft? And we know later on what he called sending aircraft later on even more flippantly, Mr. Speaker. But he opposed the mission from that date. We then brought back an extension of that mission to debate in this House in March of this year, Mr. Speaker, when the mission was extended and changed slightly to include bombing missions into ISIS targets in Syria. And there have been some of those to success, Mr. Speaker. At that time, the then Liberal leader, third-party leader, now Prime Minister, established 4 principles he said the Liberal Party would use in deploying military troops. One, that Canada had a role to play, that there be a clear mission and role, a clear and transparent debate, and how can we help best. So there's clearly a role to play. There's a clear mission and role. In fact, President Hollande and other leaders are ramping up the mission, not to deter and degrade ISIS, into a defeat ISIS. We're having another clear and transparent debate. In fact, we're bringing this debate to the House. It should be that government, since they're altering the mission, Mr. Speaker. So I guess it comes down to the 4th pillar. What role can Canada play? We have one of the most highly trained, highly effective air forces in the world, Mr. Speaker. I was proud to be an officer in our RCAF for a few years, never in the Top Gun role that some of our men and women are doing overseas. But we have some of the best equipment, the best capability, and the best training to assess each mission and to be part of this coalition to make sure that we're getting targets and that there aren't civilian lives at risk, to ensure that we're defeating and degrading ISIS and not allowing conflict to spread into urban areas, Mr. Speaker. We have that capability possibly better than most countries, with a handful of NATO countries being our equal in this unique role of targeting with certainty, Mr. Speaker. We're flying 2% of the missions, that's commensurate with our size and participation, Mr. Speaker. At a time when our allies are asking the coalition to do more, Canada is turning back, Mr. Speaker. This government needs to listen as much to the sunny ways of Mr. Laurier, but also to its Pearsonian and Mackenzie King traditions, Mr. Speaker, and not withdraw Canada.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Laval-les-Îles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again I congratulate my colleague from the opposite side of this House. I would like to ask my colleague if he has a clear idea about our efficiency in our military involvement of our CF-18 on that fight against ISIS, and if he clearly understands the other steps that our government is taking in order to cripple ISIS in other ways. Mr. Speaker, the high cost of our involvement with CF-18, our government decided to use this money in order to provide it for humanitarian aid to those who are in need. And that's exactly what we are going to do. Couple that, Mr. Speaker, that our government will undertaking to provide an excellent training to the army forces of Iraq and to the police of Iraq, and those forces are capable to do efficient combat and efficient result on the ground because they understand perfectly the geographic situation of that part of the world.
No, that's it. No, we've run out of time. The honourable member for Laval-les-Îles, we have 5 minutes for questions and comments. We're trying to fit as many people in as we can. The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for that question. Certainly, as I said at the conclusion of my remarks, perhaps no better country can do the type of mission that needs to be done. The assessment pre-flight, pre-sortie, and the post-flight damage assessment to make sure that we're actually hitting the targets we need. And I know from talking to colleagues and contacts in the RCF, most of our missions don't deploy their weapons, Mr. Speaker, because they can't have the certainty they need to make sure that the civilian, there's no civilian damage or death, Mr. Speaker. Our country does this alongside some of the NATO countries better than anyone else. I'd refer the member to what we've been doing, the humanitarian mission, the refugee mission, and the military mission. There's refugees because of ISIS, Mr. Speaker.
Exactly.
We're the 5th largest donor country. We've been playing a role in all 3 important elements of this mission. Why are they making us pull back from that 3rd important military contribution?
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Salaberry-Sirois.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et puis, je voulais simplement demander à mon collègue pourquoi il veut absolument qu'on continue le combat aérien quand il y a plusieurs spécialistes qui disent que les combats aériens, ça contribue à aider l'État islamique à recruter des gens, des civils sur le terrain et donc à continuer à faire plus de victimes au sein des populations civiles dans les pays où l'État islamique est en train de faire des frappes. Donc, il y a beaucoup plus de dommages que d'aide qu'on est en train de faire. Et ce que l'ONU demande, ce que le Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU demande, c'est de priver justement, priver le financement aux terroristes, priver aussi le recrutement, puis aider les gens de façon humanitaire, ce que les conservateurs ne proposent pas.
Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member for the question. It concerns me that her question is very similar to the approach the Prime Minister brought to the House earlier this week, in that we can't talk about ISIS because we're going to be somehow promoting their propaganda, Mr. Speaker. I'd recall, last year in October when we had the terrible attack in Ottawa, some of the early pictures coming out of that episode were from ISIS sources, Mr. Speaker. This is a group that is engaged on social media, is radicalizing people online and through the media. So to somehow feel we can divorce ourselves from discussing the threat that they are, Mr. Speaker, and our response is absurd. What we've been doing is the original mission to degrade and destroy the ability for ISIS to take more ground. And as I said in my remarks, 25 to 30% less territory in Iraq and in parts of northern Syria as a result of airstrikes, Mr. Speaker. We've contained and controlled. The debate in the U.S. and France and other countries right now is about a ground commitment, Mr. Speaker. That's the second phase to this response to a growing and real threat to Canada. We're withdrawing from the first phase, Mr. Speaker, in our modest contribution to it. It really is a backtracking from traditional global multilateral actions that the Liberal Party of Canada supported for 50 years, Mr. Speaker.